Welcome, everyone, to the November 13th edition of Wednesday with Walton and Newberry, coming to you here in video form at thecardinalnation.com and in audio form at the Scoops Sports Network and all your favorite podcast apps. Hello, Blake.
Hey Brian, how's it going?
Good, good. It's great to be back home, sleep in my own bed, although it was a lot of fun in Arizona. And next week we'll recap all the players now that when the fall league is done and discuss some of the things I saw down there. This week we're going to go back and have one last discussion about 2024 across the Cardinal minor league system. One of the things that we do every year faithfully at the Cardinal Nation at the end of the season is go through a series of articles where our local reporters recap the season at each affiliate. They select the top players, pitchers, relievers at each level. Then we do system-wide awards. And one area that Blake always focuses on each year is the top rookies. And in the past, we had a rookie starter and a rookie reliever, but in the last few years, the Cardinals have adjusted how they handle the pitchers after the draft. And it's pretty much a challenge to come up with pitchers of any kind who throw after they're signed the first year, right?
Yeah, it's tough. I was looking at this year's list as I was going through it, and there were literally two pitchers, I think, who appeared, or maybe three, but only two even cleared 10 innings. So left us with a pretty considerably small list of candidates, but fortunately, both of them were actually really good in their limited time on the mound.
Well, let's talk about the two. Both of them, of course, played with Peoria, which is the typical place where collegiate players start. And we had Michael Watson and Nolan Sparks.
Yeah, Michael Watson and Nolan Sparks, obviously, like not the biggest names the Cardinals drafted. I mean, you have a guy who was a day three pick and a guy who was actually signed and went undrafted. But both of them were actually really good. And you look at them, Michael Watson made 11 appearances, put up an 0.68 ERA. Nolan Sparks made 10 appearances and put up a 2.35 ERA. Both of them were really good, and they both have really interesting traits. There's a reason they fell, and they probably profile best as relievers going forward. But like I look at a guy like Michael Watson, and he struck out 47% of the batters he faced, which admittedly isn't that many batters in a 10 inning sample, but it's notable. That's a huge rate. And it's especially notable for a guy who only throws 90 miles per hour. But it honestly doesn't really matter all that much because he gets over 7 feet of extension. So his fastball might be 90. It's looking more like 91, 92 to a hitter, which admittedly still isn't that fast, but it just gets on them a little bit quicker. And he also just throws from an incredibly low arm angle. So when he actually throws his fastball up in the zone, which is what he likes to do with it, it looks like it's flat and rising to a hitter. And it's just really tough to hit. He lived off of his fastball in single lanes. He's probably gonna have to mix in some more secondaries as he climbs the ladder, but it's a fastball that plays a lot better than you would expect a typical 90-mile-per-hour fastball to play. And that makes him a really interesting undrafted signing and a guy that it was frankly worth the Cardinals taking a shot on.
And the Cardinals have not only gone after some of these guys from odd places like an NA, not an odd, but non-typical in NAIA school. But is it me or does it seem like they're looking for a lot of sidearm guys too?
Yeah, they are. And that's actually, I know we're not going to cover these guys on this episode, but the Cardinals have picked up a couple guys this offseason who have the same kind of profile with a release height below 5 feet, who look like they're throwing directly from the side. And I don't know, that's something they seem to be targeting. Now, typically that kind of a profile leads to fastballs that play well at the top of the zone. You can get profiles like a guy like a Cooper Jerpy, for instance. You can get a lot of guys like that who really get a lot of sweep or a lot of horizontal movement on their pitches, but sometimes it does come with the added risk of showing heavier platoon splits. So interesting to see the Cardinals targeting that kind of a pitcher, but it's a decent bet, and it is interesting to actually see them having, a legitimate plan for the kind of pitchers they want to bring into the organization.
So Michael Watson is our rookie pitcher of the year, and he said his ERA was 0.68. His FIP was 1.08. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of mirage there. Now we'll see what happens when he moves up to Palm Beach. But then the runner-up, Nolan Sparks, his numbers weren't quite as good, but still respectable.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Nolan Sparks, not quite the same extreme kind of a mold as Michael Watson, but he too throws from a lower than average release height. He too has a fastball that's probably his best pitch. And I think that shows a little bit of a shift in the Cardinals thinking. And they have a couple guys now that they've brought in like that, especially in the draft, where the pitchers have their best pitch is their fastball, or at least their fastball is at least an average or better offering. And that's something that the Cardinals typically haven't targeted in past years. They've had a lot of guys in the system who really like have some decent secondary stuff, but are held back by lack of a quality fastball. So it's interesting when I see a guy like Michael Watson and then a guy like Nolan Sparks, obviously late picks, but even the earlier picks had the same kind of trend where they have good fastballs. And then when you see these guys getting the game action, and I think Watson's fastball missed bats at a 40% rate. Sparks was probably at 30, 35, if I remember correctly. So these guys, I mean, granted, single A, small sample, admittedly, but they have good pitch shapes. The fastball's grayed out well, and they're missing bats so far in a limited sample, and it's good to see.
All right, so let's switch gears now and talk about the top rookie hitters. And unlike the pitchers, where we had one drafted pitcher and one undrafted pitcher make it into game action, 8 of the 9 position players drafted started play. Of course, again, everybody came into Palm Beach, and of course, that created an opportunity for a bunch of other guys from last year's draft to move up, most notably Chase Davis, but a bunch of others as well. So 6 of the 8 position players that saw action were above average hitting wise. So this was a little bit more interesting, at least, to look at these various performances and come up with your choice as the rookie player of the year. But surprisingly, it wasn't JJ Weatherholt.
Yeah, JJ Weatherholt is who you would expect. I mean, pretty scouts love every part of his game. I loved every part of his game when the Cardinals drafted him. He looks like just he's going to be an amazing hitter going forward, and you would hope that he is. But Ian Patrutz just came out and just hit everything. He was hitting the ball hard. He was drawing walks at a super high rate. I mean, I think looking at it, he batted 344, OBP'd almost 500 in his time in single A. Like he just had a crazy season. And frankly, it's not a 173 or 172 WRC plus is what he actually had. That level of WRC plus is surprising, but it's not surprising to see him hit the way that he did in single A, since he was a really good hitter in the Big Ten and the SEC in college. I think he struck out at less than a 10% rate in the SEC, facing some really advanced college pitching. He's hit the ball well everywhere he's been, and his bat is what profiles the best in his profile. So he's a guy that's not surprised to see him hit the ball well. It was surprised to see him hit the ball better than JJ Weatherholt, who also had a really good debut season.
Yeah, Weatherholt came a little slow out of the gates, and Patrutz hit right away. And I want to step back for a minute and make sure that folks listening to this understand we're not saying that Ian Patrutz is going to be a better major league player than JJ Weatherholt someday. We're saying in the at-bats that they took, which they had over 115, 120 plate appearances each, Ian Patrutz had a better start. He out-OPS JJ Weatherholt by over 100 points of OPS. So for 2024, Ian Patrutz was a better player at the level that he was playing. That's all better hitter. That's all we're saying.
Yeah, exactly. If you were going to ask me who is going to be the better hitter and the better player going forward, my answer is obviously going to be JJ Weatherholt. But when you get a guy like Ian Patrutz, who was a day 3 pick, whose profile matched what his early results have been, it's fun to see. And he's a guy who, I think teasing our prospect list a little bit will be in our top 50. And when you get a guy who was drafted on day 3 to appear in the top 50 and less than 200 plate appearances, it just shows how impressive a season he really had.
And the Cardinals picked up a couple guys with catching pedigrees, I think in the 4th and 6th round, Ryan Campos and Josh Cross. Both those guys played pretty well too. Campos had numbers very competitive with Weatherholt.
Yeah, he did. And Campos admittedly was not a guy I was super high on after the draft, just because he tends to beat the ball into the ground a lot. He doesn't really have a hitting profile that you expect to hit for a lot of power going forward. But Campos hit everything, took a lot of walks, and all the reports are, from most scouts coming out of college, he plays a solid defense behind the plate. And I think that'll be what's interesting to monitor is what happens with Campos and Cross, because Cross was playing first base DH exclusively after being drafted, and whereas Campos got a lot of time behind the plate. So interesting to see if that was maybe, let's play Campos and rest Cross after a long college season, and maybe they end up splitting time going forward. Because I know Cross was announced as a catcher when he was drafted, but Campos does have more, defensive projection on him than Cross probably does. So if Cross is going to move to first base permanently, that obviously puts a little bit more pressure on his bat. Whereas if Campos can prove himself to be at least an adequate defender behind the plate, there's a little bit less pressure on his bat.
Yeah, yeah. And, Campos hit 319, Cross only hit 216. So, there's quite a bit of difference in batting average. Again, relatively small sample. We're talking about roughly 100 plate appearances.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the thing about Cross that I was not expecting was for him to actually draw walks at a 16% rate, because he was a pretty aggressive hitter in college. So the walks kind of buoyed his offensive profile a little bit. I expected him to hit for more power than he did. Obviously, we're still talking about small sample sizes, so things can normalize, but I'm not expecting him to maintain a 16% walk rate going forward. So you would hope that after an offseason of being in the system and maybe a larger sample size next year, that you would see that bat come around a little bit more.
Yeah, and you mentioned walk and strikeout rate. Campos had equal walk rate and strikeout rate. And I don't care who you are at any level, anytime you can do that, that's worth noting.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And I think actually, as we look at the 8 finalists for this award, 7 of them had either an equal walk and strikeout rate or a higher walk than strikeout rate. So these guys just had great swing decisions across the board, drawing a ton of walks, making a lot of contact. And I think that was one of the things we really maybe saw the Cardinals target in this year's draft.
And, in all fairness, too, we're talking about experienced college hitters coming in against A-ball guys, some of whom are still, young international guys. So again, 2025 will be interesting to see how this sorts out, which ones make Peoria out of spring camp, which ones repeat Palm Beach, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really what's going to be interesting to see. It's always fun to see what these guys can do. But again, you would expect these guys who played 3, 4 years in college to be able to hit pitchers that are 20, 21 years old in single A. So really the true test for them is going to be what happens when they get to Peoria and Springfield and Memphis going forward.
All right, now let's switch gears and talk about the entire system. That we talked about the rookie pitchers, the rookie hitters. You wrote several articles about both hitters and pitchers, and we'll start with the hitters and counting stats. And of course, counting stats are ones that award those players who played every day, who stayed healthy. And the rate stats that we'll talk about afterward are, of course, less dependent on how often they played and how good they did when they did play. So what did you consider are significant in counting stats to look at players across the system?
Yeah, I think it was interesting to look at the plate appearances because you see just to start, I mean, obviously not a super meaningful stat in terms of player performance, but the guy who finished in first was Nathan Church. The guy who finished tied for third was Thomas Sajacy, and then we saw both of those guys go to the Arizona Fall League. And Sajacy would have finished higher than third if I'd actually factored in his MLB plate appearances.
Oh yeah, if you'd added in his whatever it was, 30 games in MLB, he would have blown everybody away in plate appearances. But it's good to see that he's durable, that he's healthy, that the Cardinals felt like he could handle that additional workload in Arizona on top of a very busy regular season.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think that's obviously a different situation than with pitchers, because you want to really limit the amount of innings you put on their arm after a long season. But with hitters, it is good to see that those guys were not kind of tired and getting shut down at the end of the season, but really wanted to go out to the fall league and work on some of the holes in their game. So definitely good to see that. The home runs I thought were interesting because obviously you have Luke and Baker up there with 32. He's basically going to be number one in that metric for as long as he's in the minors and as long as he's in the system because
But again, we got to. Well, I don't know how many days Luke and Baker spent with St. Louis, but it was well over a month. Might have been 2 months, and he still hit 32 home runs. Now his batting average wasn't anything to speak of, but yeah, as long as Luke and Baker's around, he's going to be the home run guy. It's just well, it'll be interesting to see whether history makes him the next John Gall, next Stavanoa kind of guy, or whether he can maybe have a flash in the pan like a Luke Voigt or. I don't know. It's hard to see how it's going to work for him in St. Louis, especially with the decision made that Contreras is going to see more time at first base, and they can't really play Burleson in the outfield. So first base still looks blocked for Luke and Baker.
Yeah, it does. And frankly, I don't think Luke Baker's future looks too exciting in St. Louis from his own perspective. Obviously, he might have an exciting future in the majors. It's probably just going to have to happen with another organization. But I think what was particularly interesting was to see the rest of the guys on that list. You have Matt Koperniak, Thomas Ajaci, Matt Lloyd, and Mike Antico bringing up the top five.
Those are not the names that at the beginning of the season I would ever have thought. Mike Antico's a speed guy. Lloyd's a guy they basically picked up off the scrap heap. Sajacy, you thought, well, maybe doubles power, but home runs. And Koperniak, he's just a guy that continues to do everything well, but for whatever reason, never seems to get a chance.
Yeah, exactly. And that was my take from that too, looking at those guys. And I think Sajacy, the 20 home runs that he hit, tied for second in the system, really just goes to show that he holds the ball in the air tremendously well, even though he doesn't hit the ball actually that hard. And that obviously is what lends itself to over the fence power. A lot of his home runs do come to the pull side. Matt Koperniak being up there was one that was particularly interesting because I've always considered him somebody who's a really solid hitter. Overall, makes solid swing decisions, makes a good amount of contact, has decent pop, but is not somebody I would have expected to actually finish top 2 and top 3 in the system in home runs. So that was good to see. And I hope, just for the sake of seeing what he can do, I hope he gets a chance in the majors.
I guess the other side of that coin is, when you see a guy like Jordan Walker spend most of the year in the minor leagues, for him to not even have 15 home runs, not even rank in the top 5, is a little discouraging. And, as much as we can celebrate what these players did, other than Luke and Baker, there isn't really anybody in the Cardinal system who you could say right now has the capability to hit a lot of home runs in the major leagues.
Yeah, you're right. There's definitely the flip side of that coin, which is if you have four guys on that list who you wouldn't have expected to be there, that means you had a bunch of other guys who you did expect to be there who didn't make it there. So ideally, we would see more progression out of Jordan Walker next year. I think he'll get a good long look in right field, but definitely not the kind of season we were hoping to see him have.
Um, Two-time Independent League American Association batting champion Brian Torres. We gotta throw a shout out to this guy. Stuck in Double A, shouldn't have been. Led the system both in hits and walks.
Yeah, and he also led the system as we kind of get into the rate stats a little bit too in batting average and OBP, which is what you would expect from hits and walks. So
And
the guy,
second in runs scored.
yeah, and he steals a ton of bases. Like he's just a really fun player to watch. He does like all the things you would want out of like a premier slap hitter. Be patient at the plate, make contact with everything you see, take the extra base, play a solid defense in the outfield. Like he's a guy who is just a really fun player, and I would really like to see him get another chance to actually maybe go up to Memphis and put himself on the doorstep of the majors.
Yeah, I think Torres, I mean, led the system in batting average, as you said, OBP as well. So he's a guy that you think could help Memphis out this next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'd be fun to, I don't necessarily know if there's a huge major league future for him, but it would be fun to see him get the chance to maybe be like a pinch runner, defensive specialist kind of guy. And I mean, if he makes more out of his career, then good for him.
There was a good battle this year in the Double A Texas League between Torres and Jimmy Crooks, catcher Jimmy Crooks, for the batting title. Crooks eventually slid back a little bit all the way to 321, which is still magnificent for a catcher. And part of the reason that Crooks was named the player of the year for the system, both by us and the organization, was not only was he second in batting average of the system, but he was also third in on-base percentage at 410, and was fourth in slugging as well, almost 500. So Crooks fell just an eyeball short of a 300, 400, 500 year.
Yeah, so what you're saying is he hits the ball a lot, he draws a lot of walks, and he hits the ball for power, and he does that while playing catcher. It's hard not to be excited to play like that.
Yeah. And we'll see what what that means for the future. The Cardinals are going to give a lot of playing time, it appears, to Ivan Herrera and Pedro Pajes. Crooks will probably be the guy at AAA, although they've got a couple of experienced guys there as backups as well. But you would think this time next year, we'll be talking about where Jimmy Crooks fits in the St. Louis mix.
Yeah, I think we will, and that's where it'll be really interesting to see what happens at the major league level because I think for Crooks, it's probably good that Wilson Contreras is moving to first base. The Cardinals are going to get a whole season to evaluate what they have in Ivan Herrera and Pedro Pajes, and I think Crooks is a better player than Pedro Pajes probably. So I would not be shocked if after next season we were talking about a platoon at catcher, not necessarily a straight platoon, but Ivan Herrera and Jimmy Crooks splitting time with Pajes out of the picture, or anything can happen. Like if Ivan Herrera stutters, stumbles in the majors, then all of a sudden you have Jimmy Crooks ready to pounce when he gets a chance. So I think Crooks has shown too much for him to be a prospect the Cardinals are willing to give up on. It's just a matter of is he going to have the opportunity ahead of him in probably the next year or two.
So let's talk about speed. Last year, this was the Victor Scott article. Certainly, Victor Scott still was, I think, maybe tied for fourth or fifth in the system in stolen bases. But Antico was there, as you would expect. Torres was there. But the leader, Miguel Villarreal, was a guy that was a stalwart at Palm Beach much of the year. Then he moved up to Peoria. He's a guy the Cardinals picked up off the Rule 5 minor league list. Not going to be a future star, but a guy that filled in some good holes in the system this last year.
Yeah, he did. And Villarreal was a really interesting player too, because again, you don't typically expect guys who are just picking up off the scrap heap to be good, but he was fifth in the system in batting average, actually hit 303. He was one of the few players in the system who batted over 300. And then, as you mentioned earlier, he finished first in the system in stolen bases with 39, but then he was also fourth in stolen base success rate. And I took a minimum of
ahead of Victor Scott, by the way, excuse me.
Yeah, which is huge. I mean, Villarreal, I think his speed is a little bit underrated. Because we typically just don't see scouting reports on guys that aren't top prospects, and then Villarreal just kind of slips through the cracks. But he's a guy who can actually really make an impact on the bases, and he's not only like fast, but he's good at stealing bases, and he's aggressive enough to actually take advantage of it. So with a guy who gets on base, gets a lot of hits, and can steal bases, it's a fun profile.
We never saw Jose Fermin get much of a chance with St. Louis, but he was a guy who was very effective, stole 18 bases, was 90% successful, the highest success rate in the system. So he's a guy who obviously, knows when to go and has a high chance of being successful doing it.
Yeah, and it felt like for me, it was up in the majors for quite a while, even though he didn't play that much. I mean, I think he had like 60 games in the minors and stole almost 20 bases in that time. So I mean, he was aggressive down there when he was able to, and he's a guy who looks like he can actually steal bases pretty effectively.
All right, so let's talk about pitching. Counting stats for pitchers. Michael McGreevy is the workhorse again. In his 3 years in the system, 28 starts, 27 starts, 31 starts this last year between the majors and minors. But as you've talked about a number of times, McGreevy may have made the final step forward by figuring out how to be more effective against left-handed pitching, which was his primary Achilles heel before.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really what is going to give him a long look in the Cardinals rotation this year, even if I would expect him to start the season in the rotation. But if he doesn't, he's probably the sixth or seventh man, the first guy or second guy up after somebody gets injured. And that's typically a role that's going to lead you to probably 100 plus innings in the majors. So I think McGreevy, when you look at him, his stuff isn't really explosive. He doesn't strike out a ton of batters. You're not expecting to see a guy who's probably a mid-rotation starter or better, but for a guy who is as consistently durable as he is, with as good of command as he has, it's not hard to see a guy who can be a back-end starter for a little while in the majors.
And Gordon Graceffo, kind of fell off the radar last year, had a lot of injuries. When I say last year, I mean 2023, had a lot of injuries, but he was tied with Quinn Matthews for second in the system with 26 starts through 130 innings. So, maybe this was a year for Graceffo to reset. He was certainly healthy and try to get his name back in the picture with St. Louis as well.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the hope. We saw when Graceffa really broke out as a prospect, his stuff was explosive. His fastball had gained a couple extra ticks. He was missing bats. He's just not doing that at the same rate. His fastball has never looked like what it did a year or two ago, and his breaking stuff just isn't as sharp as it has been in the past. So you would hope that this year can be something of a reset year, and he can maybe get his feet under him a little bit and then start taking those next steps towards being a long-term starter. If not, I think he's still somebody who could benefit from pitching out of the bullpen where his fastball maybe is 2 miles per hour faster, sliders to tick harder, a little bit sharper. And now all of a sudden you're looking at a guy who can be a really effective shorter stint pitcher, even though I don't think it's late enough for the Cardinals to give up on his dream of starting yet.
Quinn Matthews, I mean, we could spend a whole episode talking about him, but uh, tied for second in starts, second in innings pitched, 202 strikeouts, which was 66 more than the next closest player in the system, which was McGreevy. His 202 strikeouts were the most in minor league baseball, and nobody else had more than 174. So, Matthews not only was exceptional, but he's figured out how to strike out batters at 4 different levels.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is you see a guy like Michael McGreevy who's been so healthy and consistent and pitches a lot of innings, and then you see Quinn Matthews do the same thing, but then you also see Quinn Matthews striking out a ton of hitters. He's probably the safest, most sure bet starter in the Cardinals system right now. I think he might not necessarily have the highest ceiling as a pitcher, but when you look at a guy like Tink Hence, he hasn't yet really proven the ability to pitch deep into games and hold his stuff into it. His stuff might be a tick better than Quinn Matthews, but if Quinn Matthews can hold it for 7 innings, still strike out a ton of batters, and stay healthy over the course of his career with 4 solid pitches, it's hard to bet against that as being at least a mid-rotation starter going forward.
Now, the last area we want to talk about briefly is pitching rate stats. And here, as opposed to the previous, the counting stats, which were dominated by the upper end of the system, a lot of the pitchers who had the best numbers in terms of ERA and FIP were A-ball guys or lower.
Yeah, and I think this is where I get really excited about what the Cardinals have in the system, especially at the lower levels. I think their pitching staff as a whole in Palm Beach this year was really, really good and really underrated. I think they have a number of guys. They probably have at least 3 pitchers on that staff, whoever they're going to end up being, that will make major league debuts. I think they have a number of guys who are going to climb up rankings here in the next year or two. And even in this offseason, as some of the public outlets start to put out their rankings. And I think it's fair. The Cardinals have, I mean, we look at Luis Castellum, he pretty much dominated every single metric on that list. And
Our reliever of the year for the system.
yeah,
And what's his pitch? The slider that's the killer.
the changeup. His
Changeup,
changeup
yeah,
is
changeup.
probably a 70 grade pitch. It is absolutely filthy. It is a carrying pitch. It can carry him to the majors. His fastball is pretty decent. It's not bad. His slider's decent, not bad. I don't necessarily know if there's a future for him as a starter, but he looks like a changeup dominant reliever going forward. And I wouldn't mind the Cardinals pushing him to be one.
First in the system in FIP, 2.43. First in expected FIP, 2.16. So keep an eye on Luis Castellum. Anybody else among these rate stats pitchers you want to call out?
Yeah, I think Darlin Saladin is another one who's really interesting to look at because, and Gerardo Salas too. We'll just lump both of them in there because they're both primary fastball guys. And what I mean by this, their fastball is their best pitch. They can still develop their secondaries a little bit more, but they were missing a lot of bats out of the rotation, showing good control. And they both, I think they both got promotions to high A this year. I know Saladin did. I don't remember if Salas did. I'd have to go back and look at it. But both of these,
He did not, but he's pitching, I think, in the Mexican League in winter, and I'm sure he'll move up in the spring.
yeah, exactly. And they both kind of put their names on the map. I think they look good as potential starters going forward. And I think when you have the Cardinals, sometimes we've seen a gap in like either Peoria or Springfield with where they just don't really have any quality starters. They're bringing guys externally. It's a bunch of like lower names. The guys that aren't really prospects kind of filling in the gaps. I think what we're going to see this next season and the year after is a lot of guys who you could put in that rotation in Peoria and Springfield, and a lot of guys who they're just going to run out of names that they can put in the rotation. They're going to have to pitch in the bullpen away for injuries. And I think that's a good problem to have.
The last one I wanted to mention was strikeout rate. Not surprisingly, the top four, you got Quinn Matthews, you got Gastelum, and you have Tink Hence, who, when he's in there, is exceptional. But the guy who's second, just 0.2 of a percentage point behind Matthews, is Cooper Jerpy. And, again, we're waiting to see what's going on with Cooper Jerpy's shoulder. Is he going to be okay? Are they going to continue to try to start him? Are they going to make him a reliever? What's going to happen with him? But again, sort of like Hence, when he's out there, he's exceptional.
Yeah, this gets back to what we were talking about earlier. Cooper Jerpy might have stuff that's a little bit better than Quinn Matthews. Quinn Matthews is more consistent and healthier, and that's what kind of gives him the edge in my mind. But Cooper Jerpy might have some of the best bat missing stuff in the system. I mean, frankly, it might be better than Hence. It at least rivals Hence. And I think there's a chance that if he stays healthy, he becomes the best pitcher out of this like upper tier of pitcher prospects the Cardinals have. Now, getting him to stay healthy is going to be the issue. But whenever he's on the mound, he misses a ton of bats with his entire arsenal. He has a good fastball, he has a good changeup, he has a good sweeper, he has a good cutter. Like he has all the pitches you would want to see him have. He just needs to stay on the mound.
All right. And so with that, we will close this issue of Wednesday with Walton and Newberry for November 13th. We, as you heard, recapped a number of the leaders, pitchers, and hitters across the system in 2024. And as Blake alluded to earlier, we've started our top 50 prospect countdown for 2025. That started yesterday, and we'll be rolling out one player through the rest of the year and into January, as we do here at the Cardinal Nation every year. We'll make just enough of the articles free so that it whets your appetite and you can see the quality of work we provide. But to read them all, you need to subscribe to the Cardinal Nation, and I encourage you to do so. It's $79.95 for the year. We haven't raised our price since 2005. And so there's a money back guarantee. So if you try it for a week and you don't like it, come back to me and I'll give you your money back. But I can tell you that doesn't happen very often. So please consider subscribing to the Cardinal Nation. You can read about the work that Blake did, all these articles here that we touched on today. You can go into much more detail on them if you're a subscriber. And with that, we will close Wednesday with Walton and Newberry for this week, and we will see you on the 20th. Thanks, Blake.
Thank you.